when you're children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then later on, we ask people, well, what specialty do you want? Where do you want to go? And one of the pieces of advice I always give to my students is don't figure out what you want to be, but figure out what you are.
Paging Dr. Cook. Paging Dr. Cook. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR.
Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prescription for Success. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, your host for the podcast, which is a production of MD Coaches, providing leadership and executive coaching for physicians by physicians to overcome burnout, transition your career, develop as a leader, or whatever your goal might be. Visit MD Coaches on the web at mymdcoaches.com because you're not in this alone. Don't forget that CME credit is available when you listen with us. Just look for CMify in the show notes to learn how. My guest today describes himself as physician by day and novelist by night. He pursues both of these interests and a few others as a family practitioner in Charlotte, North Carolina. So let's hear Dr. Darin Kennedy tell his story. I'm really excited about our guest today on Prescription for Success. We speak to a lot of physicians that have side gigs and side occupations, but I believe that this is our first novelist, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Dr. Darin Kennedy. Darin, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
Well, Darin, as we always do, we want to get a look at your entire career trajectory, and we like to literally begin at the beginning. And I see that you are a North Carolina native and did pretty much all of your growing up and getting educated in the Winston-Salem area. Is that right?
Yes. So I grew up in Boy Scouts. I was an Eagle Scout. And when I was 11, 12, 13, the way that we would raise funds for the troop were we would go sell drinks and peanuts and everything at the Wake Forest football games. And so I had it in my head from a very early age that when it was time to go off to college that I wanted to go to Wake because I'd always been around that. Fast forward to the end of high school, I simultaneously decided I was going to go to Wake, but then because that is not an inexpensive place to go, I also decided to take an Army ROTC scholarship, and that's going to become important when we get to a later part of the interview. But that is how I was able to afford to go to Wake, and that made it to where we know not crippling student debt going forward. But I grew up just south of Winston-Salem in Davidson County. And then I went to Wake for undergrad, not knowing at the time that I was going to go to medical school. And then when I ended up applying to medical school, I got in at Wake Forest, which at that time was still Bowman Gray School of Medicine. That was our class, the class of 97 was the last year to actually be called Bowman Gray. And I always remember one of the funniest things is there were 6 freshmen in my freshman suite, and 3 of us were in that class. And so we had a 50% rate of getting into that class at Wake Forest. I don't know what it was about our suite, but we were about 3% of the class.
Yeah, Bowman Gray was actually one of the schools that I was accepted to when I was making my applications, wound up going to Medical College of Georgia. But enjoyed being around Winston-Salem. And you mentioned that when you started undergraduate school that you didn't necessarily know at that point that medicine was going to be a career. When did that decision come about?
So it's funny. I think everybody gets to the decision that they want to go to medical school and pursue a career in medicine from a different way. And if I look back at the earliest seed of an idea, I think that in my applications to college, there was probably some references to, I'm going to be a history major and I'm going to go to law school. And I think that's the truth. But going to Wake, I was not a history major. I was a biology major. And I absolutely found out that I did not wish to pursue a career in law. The first thing was, you get about halfway through undergrad and you're like, well, I need to figure out what I'm doing the rest of my life. But then you also realize I have taken a 4-year scholarship from the United States Army. And whenever all is said and done, they are going to ask me to do something. I should probably find a career that I can do in the military that also is going to transfer whenever I'm done. And also one that is something that I actually wish to do. And as somebody that was always interested in biology and, plants and things growing up and doing a lot of forestry stuff when I was in Scouts, I had already sort of like leaned into a biology major, and that sort of aligns with a lot of the pre-med courses. And so I think pretty much by halfway through sophomore year, I had sort of solidified around, I think I want to pursue medicine, and I've already kind of on that trajectory, and to see what happens. And some of the faculty were telling me, I think if I recall, this is now seems like ancient history, but at the time they were saying you're getting started too late. Everybody else is ahead of you. You might want to find something else to look into. But I've always sort of been one of those people that once I said, no, that's what I'm doing, that I just do it. And so that was sort of how I started my trajectory toward medicine.
I'm a little surprised that your advisors thought that you were too late to the process, unless things changed. Of course, I applied to medical school back about the time they discovered fire. And the people at the medical school said to me, look, we don't want to see you until you've got a bachelor's degree, and then we can determine if you're qualified enough. But it sounds like the culture at Wake Forest is that you really need to get in the pipeline early. Is that what you're telling me?
That seemed to be what I was hearing. And I recall that I was very happy to prove them wrong whenever I got my acceptance letter over that summer.
And have you ever regretted that choice?
I don't think I think everybody has a day now and then where you ask yourself, "What have I done?"
Of course.
I think that's everybody, but I don't think I've ever once thought that I don't belong in medicine.
Right.
That's going to come up at the end when we're talking about prescriptions for success.
So you still enjoy going to work?
I still enjoy going to work. A few years ago, doing family medicine 5 days a week and then trying to go home and make books started to burn the candle at both ends a little bit. And so I've dropped down in the last few years to doing a 0.8 FTE, so I'm at work 4 days a week. And that seems to be a good work-life balance for me.
Once you got into your family practice residency, did it feel like a good fit at that point?
I sort of have an algorithm for, I teach it to my students. We do a lot of medical student education. And a lot of this will be at the prescriptions at the end, but my algorithm is to sort of decide early in the algorithm, do you wish to see patients or not see patients? Then it's, do you wish to be a surgeon or not a surgeon? And then do you wish to deal more with physical or mental health? And then lastly, do you like pediatric care, elderly care, OBGYN care, or all of the above? And you can probably guess how I came down that algorithm, but that is sort of how I sort of see it in my head. And there's 100 different ways that you can skin that cat, but that's sort of how I've always seen it.
That is a very thoughtful way to go about it. And your students are lucky to get that kind of advice from you. But I want to move your story along a little bit. As you say, you got yourself fully trained and capable of providing a highly valuable service, but now you're going to be involved with military service. So tell us what that transition was like.
So I finished up my 8 years at Wake Forest, and then I did my 3 years up at Carilion Health System in Roanoke, Virginia, and that's a 36 resident. That's an almost unopposed. It's not fully unopposed, but it's a somewhat unopposed residency. We got to do a lot of things, and I felt like that allowed me to get really good at deliveries and doing procedures, as well as getting just a good general family medicine education with a lot of evidence-based education with we had Dr. Mark Riedewald and Mike Jeremiah were two of our big evidence-based gurus there. And so I came out of residency with a lot of good skills. Then I found out that my first job in the Army was going to be flight surgeon. And what that is a doctor who cares for pilots. And so before I even got to my first job, which was at Fort Hood, Texas, they had me go to Fort Rucker, Alabama for 6 weeks. So I literally watched all my household goods get packed into a large semi truck, then got in my car and drove from Virginia to Alabama, got out of my car, and then spent 6 weeks learning how to be a flight surgeon, then got back in my car and drove due west to Fort Hood, Texas, and got out of my car and started being a flight surgeon for 2 years. And it's an interesting thing to work in a clinic where you have a Black Hawk parking lot in your backyard and you're trying to listen to hearts and lungs whenever Black Hawk helicopters are taking off. That was kind of interesting.
Well, that whole story is interesting. So I gather when you join the Army and you come in as a board-certified family practitioner, they don't ask any questions. They just assign you to what your duty is going to be, and that's that. Or was there any discussion with you at all?
I think your first duty station is very much based on the needs of the Army sort of thing. And they said, we need flight surgeons at Fort Hood. I guess that was because some of their doctors were moving on to their second or third or whatever duty station. But I literally drove onto Fort Hood, found the place where my boss was going to be, or one of my bosses, the division surgeon, went and found his office in this sort of labyrinthine building and walked in. And he literally just kind of ran his finger down a paper and said, I think you will be the new flight surgeon for 110 Cavalry. I said, yes, sir. And I said, where is that? And he showed me where to go. So I got in my car and drove over there and met my boss. When you're a flight surgeon for a unit, your boss is not a doctor. Your boss is a lieutenant colonel who is in charge of armor and helicopters and personnel, and you become one of his personnel, and you make sure that the medical mission of the unit gets done, but then you're just part of the machine. You're making all the soldiers stay well while simultaneously reporting back to the hospital to make sure that you're doing things right way. So you end up sort of having 2 or 3 bosses. It's sort of like the hospital has a piece of you. The division surgeon of the military unit has a piece of you. And then your actual boss of your unit is your main boss who sort of decides where you go. And while I was at Fort Hood, I would get up really early and go to my unit's sick call and take care of my soldiers. And then I would drive over to the Troop Medical Clinic 12, TMC 12, and then I would do sick call for pilots. And everybody else had gotten there early, but I had to take care of my unit first, get there, do sick call for the pilots and all the crew chiefs, then do flight physicals all morning until lunch. And then in the afternoon, that's where I got a lot of my procedure experience, because in the afternoons we'd be doing either flight physicals or procedure half days and I learned to do so many things post residency there, because I'm the tip of the spear. I'm the first person to see a lot of these people.
That's a pretty busy schedule. And one other thing that I would like to get into before we move on to other things, I'd like you to tell our audience just exactly what a flight surgeon does, what their responsibilities are. People might think that it's somebody that goes up in an airplane and performs operation. Obviously, it's not that at all. But tell us a little bit about what your duties are as a flight surgeon.
In the 6 weeks that I was at Fort Rucker, you get sort of a crash course where you take everything you just learned in medical school and then you sort of put it through a filter for pilots, because you have to imagine that the Army has invested a significant amount of money in not only these pilots, but in these like multi-million-dollar aircraft that they're in. So they need physicians who are experts in, can they see well enough to fly? Can they take the right medicines and be able to fly? If they have this medical condition, are they cleared to fly or not? And so every year, whenever you're coming in, one of your main things is do their flight physical, review all their meds, their problem list and everything, and make sure that they are long-term acceptable to be up in the air. And then if they get sick or need a change in medicine, then you need to determine short-term, are they safe to be up in the air? And you do up slips and down slips and all this stuff, but you are monitoring and making sure that they are okay. And then if the pilots get sick, of course, you are taking care of them to get them well as quickly as possible so they can get back to work, along with all your other soldiers.
So now you're not only a board-certified family practitioner, you're a fully qualified flight surgeon, and you get offered an all-expense-paid trip to Iraq to be in a war zone.
Yes, sir.
What was that like?
So I had finished up at Fort Hood, and I had PCS'd to that's a permanent change of station to Fort Benning, Georgia, and my job there was to go take care, basically the basic trainees of the Army at Fort Benning, and then their cadre who was doing their training. But before I left Fort Hood, that was when 9/11 happened, and I was actually at work at TMC 12 whenever that happened. And so we all knew the minute that happened that probably a lot of us were going to get to go do something. But it was not until after I had moved to Fort Benning, I got there in the summer of 2002, and about 6 months in, that was whenever everything was starting to ramp up. And so they sort of said, don't be surprised if early in 2003 you deploy to Iraq. And sure enough, in March, I left Fort Benning, went up to Fort Campbell in Kentucky, and got put into a slot as a battalion surgeon with the 101st Airborne. And then we deployed to Iraq for OIF 1, and we were all of the big events that happened in the first year of the Iraq War. I was relatively close to a lot of that because it was the 101st, and we were pretty near the front lines for a lot of that.
Tell us about some of the things that you saw. I assume that there were some significant injuries that got to your base of operations that had to be triaged elsewhere, or what would you tell us?
For the first 2 or 3 months, it was interesting. The first 3 to 4 months was where we had the significant amount of fighting of the initial, combat. And then I was there for about 10 and a half months. The remaining, 6 to 7 months were still very, very busy, but that was where there seemed to be a little bit of a lull in the combat. And they were actually sending a lot of the doctors home, and we were thinking that things were going to wrap up relatively quickly. And then they ended up, of course, not wrapping up relatively quickly. But for the first 3 months, we spent the first few weeks over there still on the Kuwait side of the border. And that was where we were prepping and getting everything ready to, have not just me, but all of my medics and all of our equipment ready to take care of people as close to the front as possible. Then there was the night that we actually crossed the berm and went into Iraq. And then we spent the first month in southern Iraq, and then the second month, not to Baghdad, but to another place. And then starting the third month, we went all the way up into the northern part of Iraq, not quite into Kurdistan. And we were staying, believe it or not, in an abandoned Iraqi Air Force base. And my home was a hangar for a MiG aircraft, but all of the MiG aircraft got destroyed back in the 1990s with Desert Storm. And so it's just this big hangar. And so we set up all of our stuff inside there, and that was where we took care of our soldiers for the rest of the time. But going back to the first 3 months, it was a very interesting time because we were a medical unit. At that time, it was me, an emergency room PA, believe it or not, a pediatric allergist. We didn't have our internal medicine. We later on got an internal medicine major, but it was me, a pediatric allergist, a PA, an RN, and then we had a bunch of enlisted medics who were all excellent and did a great job. And the medical people, we spent a lot of time getting our medics a little bit more medically trained because they don't get a chance to practice a lot of that stuff on people that are, when they're stateside. They may get to exercise their healing skills on Humvees more than they get to practice on people. But when they got over there, so we were making sure that they were good with blood pressures and dressings and all those things. We did a whole lot of training, and by the end, they were all sort of like approaching PA status. Like they would take care of a lot of stuff without even needing me to. I would just sort of sign off on what they did because they kind of knew what to do. But in addition to us, our particular unit for the first, I think it was about the first 2 to 3 months, we had a forward surgical team that got sort of attached to us. And this was an orthopedic surgeon, 2 general surgeons, and then just enough staff of nursing to take care of things. And they would have 3 tents, and they could have that whole thing set up in just a few hours. And the first tent would be pre-op, the second tent would be the OR, and the third tent would be post-op. And when we had the forward surgical team with us, we were kind of like a micro hospital. And a lot of the people that were injured would come to us. And we, the family medicine doctor, pediatric allergist, and emergency room PA, we would care for everybody and triage them. And then the forward surgical team would come and take them in order of injury and get them taken care of during some of the heavy fighting. Got through that first 2 or 3 months and everything sort of had a little bit of a lull. They reattached the forward surgical team to a different unit. And at that point on, we became a little bit more of just what we would call a battalion aid station, which is sort of like a mobile clinic that we could take care of things, but we didn't have the surgical capabilities that we did at that time. And so at that point, everybody started overflying us and going straight to the combat support hospital rather than coming to us. But we would still take care of an awful lot of people because we were, especially once we moved up to the Iraqi Air Force base up in the northern part of Iraq, we had multiple units in there, and they would all come to us for their medical care, and we would take care of them as best we could. We had sick call every morning, and some days were more busy than others. We would have it's interesting. We have all these other non-military people, like the people that ran the laundry were all Turkish, and the people who were working on switching the money over were all from Samoa. So we would have all these people from all over the world staying there on the base with us, and we would take care of them too. It was an interesting time. It was sort of all comers. You literally never knew what was going to walk in the door. So you just were ready at all times.
We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now I want to tell you about a new sponsor for us. Growing Innovation Health Solutions is a comprehensive medical billing service that allows you to shift the burden of collections off your shoulders so you can focus on patient care. GI Health Solutions has the experience and the expertise to help you manage all your billing-related chores efficiently and professionally. Their expert team will handle all your coding, claim follow-up, and billing issues to be certain you receive your payments on time. They can streamline your billing process and increase your revenue by up to 30%. With GI Health Solutions, you'll get more time with patients, less busy work, better cash flow, fewer errors, and improved patient satisfaction. So reach out to Growing Innovation Health Solutions today and let them help your medical group improve profitability and eliminate administrative burdens. Visit their website at www.gihealthsolutions.net for a free consultation.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Crow, founder and CEO for MD Coaches. Here on RX for Success, we interview a lot of great medical professionals on how they grew their careers, how they overcame challenges, and how they handle day-to-day work. I really hope you're getting a lot of great information. But if you're looking for an answer to a specific problem, management or administration challenge, or if you're feeling just a bit burnt out, like maybe you chose the wrong career, well, then there's a faster way to get the help you need. No, it's not counseling, it's coaching. RX for Success is produced by MD Coaches, a team of physicians who have been where you are. I know you're used to going it alone, but you don't have to. Get the support you need today. Visit us at mymdcoaches.com to schedule your complimentary consultation. Again, that's mymdcoaches.com, because you're not in this alone.
We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now I want to tell you a little bit about Physician Outlook. If you haven't discovered this remarkable magazine, please do so very soon. It was created by physicians, for physicians, to showcase the intersection between clinical and non-clinical interests. Whether it's writing, painting, cooking, politics, and dozens of other topics, Physician Outlook gives a physician perspective. It's available online and in print. It's really unique among physician lifestyle magazines. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook amplifies the voice of any physician who has something to say. It also engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get 3 months free when you enter our promo code RX for Success and select the monthly option at checkout. That's a really great deal on this stunning publication. And now let's get back to today's interview.
Well, after I got back from Iraq in 2004, I still owed through 2008, and so I was still at Fort Benning, and there is a family medicine residency there. So when I got back, I suddenly have a year of combat experience and, 3+ years of overall experience. So I got asked to move from taking care of basic trainees and come over to Martin Army Community Hospital. And I was there just a short amount of time before they asked me to join the faculty as a for the Army Family Medicine Residency program there. And so for the last 4 years that I was there, first I was the clinic scheduler. Then I'm going to have to think. Let's see. First I was the clinic scheduler, and I was responsible every 4 weeks for producing a schedule for about 45 providers, 4 weeks at a time. And then when I was done with that, I became a team leader. It was a 36 resident residency. And so 18 of us were A team and 18 were B team. So I was the B team leader. So I had to do all the evaluations for 18 residents every year for their officer evaluation reports and report on up. So I was the scheduler, then I was the B team leader. And then very briefly, right before I got out, I was the clinic chief. but that was just the last few months. And then I ETS'd out of the military in October 1st of 2008. But as I was looking around, I had really enjoyed the education aspect of my job in the Army. So when I started looking around, I wanted to move back to North Carolina. I wasn't sure exactly where in North Carolina, but I wanted to kind of get back home because I like to see the family. And every time I had driven home for holidays, it had been a 6 to 8 hour drive for several years. And I was ready to not have a 6 to 8 hour drive be a part of my several time a year regimen. So I said, well, I wonder if there are any residency opportunities in North Carolina. And so I just did a Google search. And it's funny. I think that by not knowing how to look for a job, I was very effective at looking for a job. I found that Charlotte, largest city in North Carolina, had a family medicine residency program. I was like, oh yeah, I applied to that way back in the day. I just said, who is the family medicine department chief? Got their phone number, called, spoke to their administrative assistant, told them who I was and what I was looking for. And I ended up with a telephone interview, then an in-person interview, and then a job offer. And so I am now on the family medicine residency faculty here in Charlotte with Atrium Health and have been since 2009.
I bet they're glad to have you. Were there any challenges in adjusting to healthcare delivery in the civilian world versus what you had been experiencing in the Army?
There are differences. Most of the care that I did in the Army was all under TRICARE, and so not only were a lot of, I still had to do the billing, but that was more to make sure that the clinic was getting the correct amount of RVUs to justify its existence. But as far as that influencing my pay or anything, not so much. But I still did it right because they taught us how to do it correctly, and you just do things right because that's how you're supposed to do it. But it also on the patient side, if you're with TRICARE, it definitely allowed them to. If I ordered something, I just kind of knew it was going to be taken care of because they're covered. And then it wasn't like I'm sending things out to all these different pharmacies. We had a like when you walked out of our clinic, the pharmacy was right there and everybody just stopped and got their meds on the way out. So you had much more of a finger on the pulse that people were actually getting their meds or not because you didn't send it to an outside pharmacy. And then we were located at Martin Army Community Hospital, which had all of the different specialties, ORs, everything. So when your people were getting their colonoscopy done or their eye surgery or whatever, it's getting done in the hospital where you show up at work every day. So you could actually go and interface with the specialists and sit down and have lunch with them and ask them, what's going on. And so that is, I don't want to say there's not collegiality out in the civilian world, but there's definitely a lot of collegiality at a big Army hospital because everybody's right there. And that helped. So whenever I got here, it's a lot more of, I feel like now I say someone needs to see a gastroenterologist, but I don't often know who that gastroenterologist is going to be or who that ophthalmologist is going to be. I just put in a referral and it's going to go out into the community somewhere. So definitely referrals is different. And then I had never had to deal with a bazillion different pharmacies before and calling this and that and the other.
That's challenging.
Yeah, it's challenging. Everything has its ups and everything has its downs and everything has its challenges. And so I would say it was different but the same, if that makes any sense.
It makes plenty of sense. And clearly, you made a success of it in the military, and you have continued to make a success of it in the civilian world. And interestingly, there is another whole dimension of you that I want to get into now, and that is Darin Kennedy, the author. It's my understanding from poking around in where I can find things on you that you actually put together your first novel while you were in the war zone. And I gather that one never got published, but pretty soon you did get published. So tell us the story of how that came about.
Actually, that novel is published. I just wrote.
Oh, is it really?
Yes, sir. I actually I wrote way back in 2003. I wrote the first half of a fantasy novel, and my idea for it was for it to be one book that finished the entire story. But so 2003, probably the second half of deployment. The first half of the deployment was really, really busy, but the second half, I always tell people that going into a war zone is long periods of boredom punctuated by short periods of terror. Mm-hmm. And so you have to find something to do during the long periods of boredom, because when you can only work out so many hours a day, and then you see your patients and you sleep and you eat, and then the rest of the time you got to find something to do. So I would borrow, our dentist had a Panasonic Toughbook, which was a little laptop. And so I went into Mosul and bought a thumb drive. And so what I would do is, when he wasn't using the computer to look at dental x-rays, or the medics weren't using the computer to send emails home, because in the first year, the access to email was not nearly to the degree of later on. When the computer wasn't being used, I would ask if I could borrow it, and I would just stick the thumb drive in, and I would write the next however many pages until somebody needed the computer again. I wrote the first half of that book. Then when I got home, I didn't really look at it much for about a year, because when you get back, you're kind of tired and you have to get reassimilated into life and your job and everything. But then probably in 2005, I said, I want to actually finish that thing. So I finished it. And then I wrote about the first half of a sequel to it. And then right around the time that I was getting into that is whenever I moved to Charlotte and got out of the military. And when I got up here, I was working on that a little bit, but then I started writing some short stories, because the wisdom at the time was get a few short stories published and then see if that can't help you, get your novel published. So I had this one thing that I was sitting on for a long while, but then I sort of had a different interest, and I wrote a completely different book that was supposed to be a standalone. It also became a trilogy. Yeah, the first book ended up becoming a trilogy, and then the second thing was going to be a standalone. It ended up being a trilogy. But then before I could finish either trilogy, I had an idea for another book that was a standalone. So I wrote that one. So it was kind of a big mishmash for the years, but I stand here right now with both trilogies complete and published, and my standalone novel complete and published. And now in the last about 17 months, I have written 2 new novels that are the beginning of what I think is going to be a much longer series than anything I've done before. And I'm really enjoying this new thing I'm working on, but getting everything else kind of done and off my plate really helped me free my brain up to actually move forward with something else.
Well, it sounds like you're fairly efficient with your time to have been able to accomplish all of that. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the genre that you write in, and if it has changed, if it has changed, or if it's going to change, or what you expect. I was delighted. I talked to so many physician authors whose books I can't find, but I was delighted to be able to find the Mussorgsky riddle on Audible, which I downloaded a few days ago, and I've heard 8 chapters already, and it's a really brilliant piece of work. And so I'm interested. You have a lot of interest in classical music that's embedded in this. You have a lot of interest in mythology and the supernatural, and it's all packaged in this incredible story, which is just really wonderfully written. You want to tell us about how that came about, and where your interest in these other art forms comes in?
So the Mussorgsky riddle is the book that I was talking about, that when I got back, before I finished the trilogy that I started in Iraq.
I see. So it actually turned out to be.
It ended up being the first book that I had published, but it wasn't the first one that I wrote. And so, I'm in Charlotte. I've got my other series is based on the game of chess, And so I've got 1.5 books of the chess series done. Then I've written a few short stories. And my interest in the classical music, I've always liked classical music, or orchestral type music. I was a trumpet player in marching band from like 8th grade through my senior year of college. So I have played more football games, basketball games, symphony, band concerts. I've never been in an organization that had a string section before, so I've never been in an orchestra. But that would have been fun back in the day. I don't think my lips can probably make much of a sound come out of a trumpet anymore. But so I had always loved that stuff. And then growing up in the 70s and 80s, every movie you went to was scored by John Williams. And so we've all heard the Superman theme, or E.T., or Jaws, or Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Star Wars, all of that stuff growing up, and just seeing how that music, as you're watching something on a screen, can bring it to life. And I mean, none of those movies would be what they are if it wasn't for John Williams and the orchestra. It just wouldn't be the same thing. But the orchestral version of Mussorgsky's Pictures in an Exhibition, I was like, well, I've never actually heard the classical. I've always heard the progressive rock, and I went and heard it, and I'm pretty sure I just fell in love with that piece of music that night. It's absolutely one of my favorites. Having heard all that, so of course I'm going to get the CD. And one day I had the CD in my hand, and when I flipped it over, they have the different movements of the piece listed. And in my head, I go, those look like chapter titles. And it was all over. I was like, I want to write a book based on Pictures in an Exhibition. So I did. So when you're trying to decide how are you going to write a book about a piece of music, but actually have people not just hear the music, but like somehow interact with it, I came up with 100 different ways to do it, and 99 of them were bad. But if you want to do that, then you're like, well, if you're going to interact with a piece of music, all music is a human being's interpretation of sonic waves that are hitting their eardrums and going into their brain. So if you're going to be in the piece of music, then you're going to be in somebody's head. Therefore, the setting of the book has to be someone's mind. And if you are someone who is exploring someone's mind, then your other main character has to be a psychic, because that is a person who can enter another person's mind. So that's where you get Anthony, and that's where you get Mira, my poor boy, and my psychic. And so once you've established that, then you have to decide, well, okay, so she can now visit Pictures at an Exhibition inside of his head, but what in the heck is the story? So a lot of people, when they write a story, I talk about it walking in the front door. Like Tolkien is like, I want to write a story about hobbits that save the world. Whereas me, I didn't set out to tell a story about Mira and Anthony. I set out to tell a story about Pictures at an Exhibition. So I say the Mira and Anthony is coming about the story by coming in the back door rather than the front door, is sort of my way of thinking about it.
That is really a remarkable approach. And I would never have imagined that in my own head. And I suspect no one else would either, and that's what makes it unique. And it really is, it's just an incredible piece of work. The imagination and the fantasy and all the ideas that you were just mentioning really fit, particularly now that I've heard your explanation of it, and I congratulate you on a terrific piece of work. It really is remarkable.
My first publisher, I'm with the second publisher now. The first publisher no longer exists, but my second publisher for the Mussorgsky Riddle and then the other 2 books that came along afterward, the best thing they ever did for me was they actually got me a deal with Audible themselves, and Audible did that audiobook that you're listening to. They lined all that up, and they got me Elizabeth Evans, who is the audiobook narrator that you're enjoying. And when I first heard her read, I got very emotional because I didn't understand how I'm still pretty low on the food chain, and I felt like I got, top-notch quality audiobook narration. I mean, she does such an outstanding job with that. I just cannot say enough about Elizabeth Evans. She's delightful.
I have to agree with you on that, and I hardly ever read anything longer than 2 or 3 paragraphs nowadays because my eyes are old and weak, and so I listen to a lot of Audible and other audio sources. Some of the performers are really brilliant. A great many of them are not, and it can ruin the book for you. But this woman is just amazing, and I know you must feel very fortunate to
I
hear
feel
your words
extremely
in her
fortunate.
voice. So what's going to come next? What's the next thing on your never-ending list of fantasy novels?
Well, I've got the trilogy based on the 3 different Russian composers. I've got the trilogy based on the opening, middle game, and end game of a fantasy game of chess to decide the fate of the world. I wrote a young adult version of A Christmas Carol where I call it Scrooge meets Mean Girls. It's instead of a grumpy old man who gets the 3 spirits come to turn his life around, it's a 17-year-old mean girl who is in serious need of an attitude adjustment, and I took care of that.
That's another great
and
idea.
So that's everything that I have available thus far. And I had an idea, and it's funny, I can encapsulate everything I've already written very well, but every time someone asks me what am I writing now, I get a little bit tongue-tied because there's so many elements to it. But the best I've come up with so far is, if you've seen the show Heroes or read any of the X-Men comics, if you've ever seen the movie Highlander, and if you've ever watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if you took all of the things that you really liked about all of those things and threw it in a blender and then served it cold through a filter of 80s music, that would be what I'm working on right now.
That's quite a collage.
That's as close as I've come to being able to say what I'm writing right now.
Well, Darin, I have really enjoyed what I've been able to get to in your first novel right now, and I'm really looking forward to finishing that. I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I want to thank you for being with us. But we are at the point where it's time for me to step out of your way for a moment, and I'm going to do exactly that. And Dr. Darin Kennedy is going to share his prescriptions for success.
So the first one I alluded to before, and this is something that I teach my medical students. We always talk about when you're children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then later on, we ask people, well, what specialty do you want? Where do you want to go? And one of the pieces of advice I always give to my students is, don't figure out what you want to be, but figure out what you are. And there's probably just a fine line between those two things. And I think both of them are a consideration. But all of us, meet people who in medical school who have a proclivity, or they have the attributes of someone that you see in a certain role. And you don't have to necessarily follow that. But at the same time, figuring out, what is it you are and what is it that brings you your passion, and then pursue that rather than just what do you wish to be. So that would be one prescription I would have. A second one, to look more at the novelist side of me than the physician side, is don't be afraid to explore your creative side, or more generally, don't be afraid to explore new things, because we're none of us the end of our story. We're always a novel that's being written every day. And so, at the point that I decided to write my first novel, it's not like I set out to be a novelist. I had finished college, med school, residency, in the Army, and I'm in the desert of Iraq and said, you know what, this would be something interesting to do. And now it's led to, I've written 9 novels, 7 of which are published. And it doesn't have to be novels or even an artistic pursuit, but don't be afraid to look into something new that you haven't experienced yet, or that you haven't tried yet. You know, it's never too late to try something new. The third would be work-life balance. And we talk about this all the time. Don't be afraid to ask for what it is you need, be it at work, at home, or whatever, to be the best person that you can be. I remember back in 2015 when I was starting to feel burned out, and I would not say that at any point I was like dreading coming to work, but by the end of each week, I was physically exhausted and I didn't want to be that anymore. And fortunately, I had an understanding boss, but also the life situation that allowed me to cut back a little bit and achieve a little better work-life balance. And that may not be the solution for everybody, but it's important to maintain happiness and enjoying what you do, because what you bring to the table each day as a physician is not just your knowledge, but it's your attitude and how you feel about your patients. And if you show up to work exhausted, they pick up on that. And if you show up at work ready to go, they also pick up on that. And so I would say whatever you need to do within what you can do to achieve the best work-life balance you can, so that you have what it takes not only to give to your patients, but when you get home, to give to your families, your friends, and yourself. And the last thing I would go with is, don't ever let someone tell you that you can't do something. I was told in college that it was too late to apply to medical school. That was wrong. I was told you'd probably never be able to get a book published. That was wrong. There are just lots of times where if the common wisdom of what you were being told was true, then I could have just said, fine, I won't pursue that. So if you're passionate about something or you want something, pursue it. Not everything is going to happen, but also not everything you are told is not a possibility is true either. And so I would say pursue the things that bring you joy. And I think that would be my last prescription for success.
Well, Dr. Darin Kennedy, I want to thank you so much for sharing your overall story with us today. It's really been quite fascinating, and certainly for sharing your prescriptions for success. A lot of wisdom in there. And we're very fortunate to have had the opportunity to be with you today. Before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to tell our audience where they can find you and find your books and anything else that you would like to share before we go.
My website, now that I have a new home for it, it is not getting hacked every other week, is at Darin Kennedy, DARIN Kennedy.com. And that's where you can learn a little bit more about me. And on there are links to all of my books. But if you look on Amazon or go to your local independent bookstore or a Barnes & Noble or a Books A Million or pretty much anywhere, if you ask for my books, they can order them. You probably will never find them on the shelf, and that's okay. But if you want to read something of mine, any place where you can buy books, all you have to do is put my name into the system and they can find my stuff. We have contemporary fantasy based on the game of chess. We have a trilogy based on every piece of Russian classical music you've ever heard of that, as we've talked about, is pretty fun. We have a young adult version of A Christmas Carol, and I hope to have some new stuff out soon. I'm at all the usual places. You can look me up on Facebook, and that's where you hear a lot about what's coming up for my books. If you want to take a look at some of my pictures of pretty flowers and with an occasional reference to my writing, you can look me up on Instagram at Darin Kennedy Author. I don't tweet very much, so you can find me there, but you're not going to get anything you don't get anywhere else, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, Dr. Darin Kennedy, it has really been a pleasure speaking with you today. And once again, thank you for joining us today on Prescription for Success. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd really appreciate a review from you, and a 5-star rating helps give our podcast much more visibility, and that helps us reach more listeners. We also hope you'll visit our Patreon page for membership-only material, like personal rapid-fire Q&A sessions with our guests. To be sure you never miss an episode, you can subscribe at rxforsuccesspodcast.com. And while you're there, learn how to get CME credit from CMFI just by listening. Special thanks to Ryan Jones, who created and performs our theme music, and also to Craig Clausen of Clausen Solutions Group, who edits and produces the show. And remember, be sure to fill your prescription for success with my next episode.